Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to our M&A boot camp. We're going to let you get situated for a quick second. Hi, Allie. So you're in Menlo Park today?
Indeed.
Yeah, I come from you live from Miami. Great. So I'll just jump in with a little bit of background and then turn it over to you, Allie, to give an intro. So J.Thelander, founder, CEO of J.Thelander Consulting, compensation data and consulting firm only covering the private markets. Over the years, we have our main survey, but then we add in these other questions that are more specific to a topic. So we are getting ready to release the results of our M&A report. And Allie, you were great to give us some content for questions. So maybe just fill everybody in on the high level of who you are and your area of
Sure.
expertise, and then give us the landscape of what you're seeing from an M&A angle.
Sure. Ali Murata. I'm a partner in the compensation and benefits group at Cooley. I've been practicing about 25 years, and my practice covers all things related to executive comp and benefits, really life cycle, early stage, late stage, public companies, do a lot of M&A governance work. And the good news is putting some capital markets work back in there.
Yeah, so you're seeing things from your practice side. Are you seeing, I know we'd had a little discussion a few minutes ago, things are picking up a little bit, and how so in the private markets?
Yes. So I think that certainly, I've got a couple of M&A, or excuse me, IPO transactions, and they are actively pursuing IPOs. Prior to, I would say the last 6 months, it was mostly late stage private companies who had wanted to go public in earlier kind of tail end of 21, 22, and had been waiting. Some of the matters on my plate now are new IPOs, so that's good news. I think that we're seeing signs of life, early green shoots.
Yeah. Yeah, we are too. And from our vantage point, we have clients right now that are both private companies as well as investment firms. So that's I don't think it's easy to raise capital right now any easier, but I think good companies are doing it. So this is the M&A, the information from our M&A report. So let's get into a few sort of areas here. Overall, we are seeing that companies have been involved in M&A transactions. Those that have been are more on the tech side, and the life sciences is taking a little bit longer. And that the incentive in an M&A transaction is typically financial for the people that either if they have an upfront payment or a payment that has to be done following the closing. So maybe you could fill us in a little bit on what that means. And I'll jump to that slide. Here we go. Let's see. Um, okay, did any of the following. So here are the different cash out, stock options, assume stock options or other equity, accelerated vesting, or the inquiring the other employees. And you can see this is a sample size of just a handful right now as our early results are coming in.
Evenly distributed.
Yeah.
And I would say, to take a step back just for a minute, and to comment on something that you had just mentioned about the motivations and how M&A has come up. Agree that, for a lot of these companies, the choices are you either raise money and you
Right.
do that one of two ways. You either bring in a new investor, or if that's not a possibility, you end up ultimately for some of these companies in an M&A process and the company gets acquired. And to the slide that you just had up there,
Yeah, let me show it because
not
yeah.
uncommon at all, depending upon who your acquirer is, of course, to expect for a buyer to expect the revesting of equity awards or deal consideration in connection with the transaction. That's on the far right-hand side of the ledger there. Interesting to me that these are, I suppose, I guess it's any of the following. So you have four respondents, but it could have been checking more than one box,
It is
right?
a check all that apply. Yeah.
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 And it isn't uncommon to see a combination of things because the revest is typically concentrated with key employees, not
Right.
every employee. Typical to accelerate the vesting of equity. Some, will assume, and only for certain persons who are continuing. And then, of course, the cash out, which I think is probably for the holders, their first choice. but you can
Right.
have a
And
cash out and a reinvest. Go ahead.
right. And the whole thing around the equity, and that it's not the topic of this conversation, but it's all tied together, is that it's so important to get the equity right to begin with because it follows you all the way through. I mean, we had a question today from a client asking about founders and founders equity and refresh. And I can't emphasize enough that you can't just have a categorically pat answer because it really is all based on the fact that you're not going to refresh if somebody got too much. And all of these components of the cashing out of stock options, or whether it's someone is going to get your key employees to revest, it's all based on the fact that it should have been done right. Otherwise, there will be adjustments to this. Okay, so talking about upfront payment versus an earnout payment to be paid following closing. Just explain to us a little bit about what those terms mean.
Sure. So upfront will be your proceeds that are received on the closing date of the transaction. And an earnout is typically a performance-based payment that is or isn't earned based on the post-closing performance of the company.
Right.
For tech company, it will often be, operational. It could be revenue. It could be any number of things. Making sure that the company is in fact living up to expectations of the acquirer. And on the life sciences side, it will take the form of milestone payments. So similar, they're just called different things. One is an earnout, one is a milestone. But in the life sciences sector, it will be typically related to approvals and advancement of the product being developed.
Right. And don't you typically see that the executives, the chiefs and the SVPs and the VPs, that they participate in the proceeds of the earnout in accordance with their stock ownership in the company?
That's absolutely right. All for one, one for all. So they will participate on the same basis. It does start to get significantly more complicated if what you have, right? So for founders who are currently holding equity, they would have the same participation and treatment as the other selling stockholders in a transaction. And it does get a lot more complicated from a tax structuring perspective if folks are holding equity awards, for example, stock options, and
Right.
that's what you have as of the time of the transaction versus holding a share of stock.
Right. Well, I mean, that was really our last recording, our last discussion, which actually, if anyone is hearing this and asking about the difference of RSUs
Mhm.
versus options versus different types, restricted stock units versus RSAs, that was a conversation that we had, and it does impact tax. And the reality is that that's a conversation that really somebody has to have with you because it does really impact a deal. And at the VP level, we see that it's once you hit past the founders and the chiefs and the SVPs, that's really where the stock, the equity that you own, no matter depending on how you own it, is done, kept in accordance with those percentages. And at the VP level down, that can be shifting around a little bit. And also, is there a time frame in an M&A transaction that somebody typically has to stay? Like, are there incentives?
I would say that the most common is probably 2 years. I see the range is probably 2 to 4 years.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a year, sometimes it's less, but often if it is sub 12 months, often the approach is different from a revest or reinvestment because those are definitely things that are intended for a longer term. Like I
Yeah.
said, the 2 to 4 year version.
Yeah, here's a couple slides on this that came from the deck talking about for retention, right? Because if
Mhm.
the M&A transaction is such that a company needs to hold on to these key employees, but the very nature of the deal is such that a private company has now been acquired by a bigger company, it's not the same situation that someone got into. So we talk about financial incentives or increased job responsibilities, promotions, or expanded career opportunities. And can you formalize these things in terms, obviously the financial incentives need to be pretty specific. And you're saying in most cases are milestone based.
That's right. And I think that like in my mind, I think about these are two separate timelines, right? You've got the making sure that the business remains intact through closing of a transaction because, with the macroeconomic climate, there's no guarantee that your deal will close. I've also worked on transactions that ended up in antitrust limbo for 24 months.
Yeah.
Um,
That's why the planning all the way
yeah.
through, I mean, from our vantage point on the compensation side to make sure, I mean, let's go back to an even earlier stage company, right? A company that hasn't
Mhm.
raised a lot of money and maybe they gave more equity and less cash and they were going to owe somebody more cash or and hoping and assuming there was going to be another round of financing for dilution. Because I've seen this scenario. And then they get an acquisition offer and everything is sideways and they haven't put in place the right leveling for the mix between cash and equity, and it causes problems because it has to be, it can't have those loose ends.
Right. And, we do, I commonly see situations where folks are needing to get additional, um, awards in connection with a change in control, like effectively like a make whole for something that was promised and not yet delivered. Always, that's always a possibility. The,
Right.
one caveat that I would mention is that there are tax implications to doing so when you're granting those awards close in time to a change in control. As a private company, there are things that can, these payments can be cleansed with a stockholder vote, but it's a process and there are steps involved. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, hey, don't worry about it. We'll just give you the money in connection with the change in control.
Right. And that actually goes to it. And again, that's not, we have this data and we talk about like, do you have a change of control and severance provision? And whether it's a single trigger or a double trigger. So it has to be, maybe you could just explain that real quick because that does matter.
It does matter. And this is what I would say as to, and I hope it's consistent with the way that you have your information sorted. But I, as a general proposition and a starting point, recommend that folks stay away from using the term single trigger and double trigger because there
Really? Philip,
isn't
what do you mean by
consensus.
that?
Well, because there isn't necessarily consensus as to what those things mean. And I've had this conversation with my colleagues internally. And so I think it's best for parties to make sure that they are um, talking about the same vesting to avoid, right, a disconnect and folks being unhappy about the resulting treatment. So I think about single trigger as uh, an award that vests in connection with and on the occurrence of a change in control.
Right.
And then a double trigger is a change in control plus a qualifying termination. I've heard from folks that they have said, single trigger is, oh, that's just a qualifying termination. But typically, and this really is coming from the public company side of things. I get that on the private company side, some of these terms are used differently, but generally speaking, single and double trigger involve a change in control as a starting point.
Yeah. Let's take a look. Here's some more
Yeah.
data on sort of what approach did you utilize for the key employees, right? And I think it's really important to plan for this because the overwhelming response is we selectively offered positions to members of the existing leadership team that were necessary to stay on with the new business. And so some of them may be more transaction oriented versus, and this is again where and the next section that we'll get into is the carve out programs, like what happens about carving out a percentage of the deal proceeds and how is that utilized?
And I think an important component of the conversation around selecting folks and making offers in connection with an M&A transaction, if you're structuring your transaction as a merger, you don't even need to have an offer and acceptance process because by law, all of the employment will automatically move. So all of the
Transition.
individuals at the target company will become employees of the acquiring company. It is not uncommon, of course, for an acquirer to enter into arrangements with key employees because they want them to have the
To
certainty of what the
stay.
future is. They
Right.
want them to agree to roll over, to reinvest. And so that conversation is a pretty common approach. However, it is important to note that, right, not everyone is going to necessarily have those conversations. And it doesn't mean they don't have a job
Right.
because their employment will automatically transfer.
We did have a question that came in about what is the is unique for a C corp acquiring an LLC.
Yeah. So, a couple of things come to mind immediately. And the first is, whether you are the acquiring C Corp or the target LLC, You need to keep in mind that if you are holding equity incentives, the C Corp structuring and the LLC structuring, right? Of course, an LLC, and I'm assuming here that the LLC is taxed as a partnership, so it's passed through.
Right.
The ability to convert LLC equity into C Corp equity is just a very different situation. The bit of good news is that if it is an LLC that is taxed as a partnership, you're not subject to the golden parachute rules under the tax code, which can really
Expensive.
be an ugly, yes, expensive and an ugly surprise for folks who are not familiar with M&A.
Yeah. Let's talk about in an M&A transaction, sort of a carve out program, because it comes
Yep,
up all the time that, well, and again, I know I sound like a broken record, but the carve out program is carving out a bonus plan, right? From a
right.
determined, I mean, I'll show the slide here that gives the definition, but you're hoping that you got the numbers right because they're going to follow you all the way through because you'll use the equity component that was already in place for the individuals, the executives or the key employees potentially to follow. I mean, that would be the easiest thing is that the part that you carve out from the deal proceeds, and of that, what individuals get is in accordance with what they currently have.
I think that that is the most common approach to it. And that's the advice that I give because presumably the legwork has been done on the front end when you're
Right,
granting the equity awards. And I think,
right.
Jody, probably worth a minute or two just on a minute or two, 30 seconds on a carve out plan and when one gets put in place. But, you're
Right. Here
typically
it is.
putting a
Here's that
carve out.
actual
Yeah.
question.
Ah,
Here's it is in accordance, and it looks like actually now the numbers have gone down, and you can see our sample sizes have gone down because there's just less people who can respond to this.
yeah. Which is probably a good sign because a carve out plan is a vehicle that's put in place when your common stock isn't typically expected to participate in proceeds from a transaction.
We got to say that slowly because right
Okay.
what that means is that the
Yep.
common stock it's not there's not going to be enough for everybody or the price has gone down or something has happened, so as a result of it you have to carve out this program to make sure that there's an incentive for people to stay.
Yes, because, and to be clear, it means in the absence of this plan, their common equity won't receive a payment. And
Right.
so, in order for them to participate in the transaction, you need to have the carve out plan, which, if you go back to the comment that Jody had made about the allocation of the carve out plan, it makes sense that if a company has been thoughtful and done their homework in allocating their equity to begin with, that the carve out plan itself will follow the breakdown of their equity because, all right, you're now delivering the incentives that you had set out to deliver in the first place in terms of the allocation.
I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, when we work clients at all different stages on their compensation plans, we're always thinking about the fact that there may be a transaction, and it's possible with the liquidation preferences that there will not be enough common stock. So you're still going to revert to this in some way. And that came up as a question, actually, as an aside, like, do you typically see anti-dilution clauses and that in some kind of deal?
Well, and I think that one of the pieces to keep in mind too. So, typically when a company is putting a carve out plan in place, proximate to an actual transaction. It's not the kind of
Right.
thing you're doing far in advance, nor would that be well received because you need to keep in mind from an economic perspective, what's happening is your essentially your preferred stockholders are giving up a portion of the proceeds that they otherwise would be
Yeah.
getting in the
Here's
deal.
the slide that actually says exactly what you just commented on. Of course, highlighting your expertise, Ali, is that the carve out plan put in place well in advance of a deal or right in connection with the deal. And it's in general, you can see that it put in place, sorry, in connection with the deal.
So, and it's you want to do like it's a balancing act of, as I mentioned, these are now your typically preferred stockholders who are taking part of their return and reallocating it to the company, and they're only going to do so if they feel like they have to, from the perspective of making sure that the deal is successful, that
Right.
folks are in their seats to actually implement and close a deal. And so those conversations they're awkward.
Yeah. Yeah. But the more organized you have, I think this is interesting. This slide shows by industry, and this came up as well. I know we had some questions ahead of time talking about medical device deals versus biotech
Yeah.
deals versus tech deals. And so, and you have a bonus plan, and it's more so with tech. And I think it really goes to what you said before is that they're easier to measure.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other question about is the carve out plan funded from dollar one, or is it have to be after, or must be a threshold?
It depends on the particular plan, but it
Yeah.
isn't. It's common for these things to be, yeah, dollar one. It's what I was going to say is that it depends. Like, it's not uncommon to have them ratcheted, and then ultimately, if you have a carve out plan, at a point in time, there will be enough proceeds that your common stock will begin to participate, and so they will sort of ratchet. There'll be a starting point, and then as the deal proceeds grow, the size of the pool declines, and typically offset by any proceeds that are received in connection with the commons so that folks aren't double dipping.
Yeah, here is that if you have, here is by industry. So if it's put in place well in advance or
Yeah.
right in connection with the deal, and you can see the numbers have gone down. I keep reflecting on this because they're just few, and we know there have been fewer transactions. But you can see that here for the ones that have done transactions, that the carve out plan was put in place well in advance of a deal versus in connection of, because you've got to plan for it and they're taking longer anyhow. So there's really no
Yeah.
reason why you wouldn't, right? I mean, how soon in advance of a deal is someone coming to you?
Well, and what I was going to say is that that's a really important distinction, because when we talk about at the time of a deal, well in advance of a deal, the way that I think about it is you're not putting a carve out plan in place on a clear day. You're putting a carve out plan in place. If you, for example, are in the process of looking for capital, looking for financing, and there are conversations now percolating at the board level around, maybe the best path or for the company is acquisition.
Right. But it's not
And
necessarily in a profitable mode. It's not in a
yeah,
smoke show good way. It's in
yes,
a way of a little bit of duress. So you
yeah,
know that you're going to have to do something in order for the key people to stay and for an incentive and some
yes,
kind of cash, some kind of profitable. I don't know if it's necessarily wealth creation, but people aren't going to stay if it's just going to be a bad ending for them and they're not going to have any equity.
that's right. And I think, particularly on the carve out plan. So it's like most things that we deal with, Jody. It's the Goldilocks. You don't want to do it too early. You don't want to do it too late. And as I've now mentioned a couple of times, the carve out plan is funded from the proceeds that otherwise would be going to your preferred stockholders.
Right.
You're right. They're sitting around, many of them, the board table. And this is not something that you spring on them at the last minute when you have a deal in hand, because now they're going into a deal having already calculated what their numbers are. And now that is, right, from their perspective, it's an even harder pill to swallow. Whereas if they go into a deal, a negotiation of a deal, knowing that this amount needs to come off the top, that's a different conversation.
Right. But it's a conversation to have. Actually, we ask these questions just by way of background. I'm really surprised by these numbers. Do you have a compensation committee? I
Mm,
mean, everyone
yeah,
has a board, but
right.
having a comp committee, only 51% would have a comp committee. And then of that, we ask who has discussions with the comp committee on behalf of the company. And it's typically the CEO. But let's face it, that's the discussion that you should be having in preparation of a deal. Are you surprised that more companies? I mean, what's your recommendation? As an industry expert for having a comp committee, and is that with whom you're first having these discussions and how you structure a deal?
Yeah, so my experience is that typically companies don't have a comp committee until they're a bit later stage,
Right, certain size.
preparing for an IPO, like where the governance is of sufficient complexity that they need to start building the muscle memory of having the comp committee and what
Right.
it is the comp committee can do. I have seen some private companies stand up a comp committee where the comp committee doesn't have any authority to act, which is tough too, because then
Right.
kind of what are you doing with people's time? And so I do agree that it is most often it's the CEO having conversations with the board. And this is one of those situations where, frankly, you don't put it on the agenda for your board meeting and spring it on people. This needs to be
It's got to be a
socialized.
discussion ahead of
Yeah.
time. We did have a question come in, which is I'm going to read the question because I
Yeah.
think obviously if it's being asked, it probably pertains to more than one person.
Mm.
It says
Yep.
under our plan, it would be possible for the company to be sold and the buyer didn't assume or replace outstanding options. Unvested options would terminate,
Yep.
right? And so I could see this upsetting executives, but I could also see the board being sticky about acceleration or agreeing to a full cash out. So that's where the carve out comes in, right?
Yeah, and typically, where I typically only see carve out plans where there isn't value in the common, because to your point here, it's if they're going to give more money, unless there's an intent to reallocate not based on equity holdings, you can simply accelerate an additional portion of the vesting. The thing to keep in mind in private company transaction is that the cost of the acceleration is being borne by the selling stockholders,
Right.
right? Unlike a public company deal, which is just different, right? You have a price per share, and that's what folks are getting. In the private company context, your selling stockholders are bearing the economic cost of the acceleration.
Right. It's coming from somebody.
Yes.
This question came up, and actually, we do have data talking about is there a typical percent of the deal? So
Mm,
we ask about the net or gross proceeds. So here
yeah.
is the bonus pool is the net proceeds only. What are the percentages? And I love these questions. I think it's so helpful. And of course, it's
Yep.
on a case by case basis, but it gives you some general idea.
Yeah.
And then here it is the bonus pool. If the bonus pool is for gross proceeds, obviously it's so here it's a little bit of a bigger number. There seems to be overlap in that 5 to sort of 8%. And then when you get into the gross proceeds, it's a little bit lower. And then we asked if does the size of the or percentage of the deal proceeds of the bonus pool vary based on the deal value, and 50-50 on that. What's your experience here?
I think the answer is yes. You could make the case obviously either way on that one because you want to incent folks to try and maximize deal value. But it is common. In my experience, it is common that as your deal size climbs, the percentage will come down, not dramatically, because you do want to incent right maximum value in connection with transaction, and
Right.
also the offset for anything that's received in connection with the equity so that folks aren't double dipping.
Yeah. So here's a few other questions that are answers that are coming up to the questions, who determines who participates? And it's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what
Yeah.
you said, the board, and then if they have a comp committee, and then the CEO.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting because I think that typically it would be the board. I say typically the board, but and the board could make a determination that, um, you know, the CEO then has a percentage that can then be allocated. And
Right.
so, right, it could be in multiple buckets.
Well, here's exactly, we'll segue to this as we're winding up here, just to be
Yeah.
respectful of everyone's time, that, what
Mm,
level of employee participates in the carve out plan. And you can see that exactly what our data shows at the other end is that it's the CEO and the other chiefs and then SVPs, and it whittles down, and then you pick the key employees. And the when are the bonuses paid? And we talk about at the closing or at the same time and subject to the same condition as stockholders. It's sort of a good way to wind up. I mean, is this again on a case by case basis, or is this
It is very much on a case by case basis, because the left hand side of that, some at closing and at closing
right?
only, and some with selling stockholders. It can become very complex very quickly from a tax perspective because you can end up creating deferred compensation if not structured properly. And so it's complicated.
Yeah.
Um,
And that question comes in here is must participants remain employed?
yes.
Exactly. This is what you're talking about through the date of
Yep.
change of control to receive. And 100% are saying yes. As you can see, there's a lot of bit of data. I mean, the data is great. It gives you a lot to think about, and it is complex. And obviously the Cooley expertise, and you in particular, you can't be, no deal's ever done without lawyers. And we appreciate everybody joining us. Ali, any broad sweeping advice for the folks on the call here?
I think the advice is the same advice. I feel like I always give this advice, but be thoughtful, plan ahead,
Yeah,
and don't find yourself on your heels.
yeah,
Like these are not
flat-footed.
decisions. Yeah, need to be
Yeah,
done thoughtfully.
yeah. And from our vantage point, it's the same thing. The earlier you see how important it is getting your mix of cash and equity, in particular equity, right in the beginning, because it'll follow you all the way through.
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks all for joining us. We'll send out a recording and a follow-up, and we'll look forward to next time.
All
Thanks,
right. Thank
Ali.
you.